But hey, welcome back. Last time we looked at some of the basic beliefs of Islam, including the 5 pillars, the 6 articles of faith. So remember all the praying 5 times a day, journeying to Mecca to the Kaaba and doing the Hajj, the zakat, giving to the poor, and then those 6 articles of faith that sounded like pretty basic stuff, like honoring God and all that. We also learned about the Shahada. That was part of the 5 pillars. And that's saying that there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. We also learned that according to modern Muslim belief, the Bible and Torah have been corrupted over time. And that's interesting because if you look at the Quran, it never claims that. And it actually only says positive things about the Bible and the Torah, and it says that God preserves his word and doesn't let any harm come to it. So that's going to cause tensions later on too, as we'll get into. And that Muhammad came to clear this up. He was given a perfect inerrant revelation, and that revelation was Allah's original message for mankind. They even believed that the Quran existed in heaven before it was given to Muhammad. It's like the perfect book. It's always existed. Almost kind of like how John 1 describes Jesus a little bit. It's like very, very highly thought of. It was Allah's original message for mankind that every other prophet had given before him. Okay. Further, we learn that in the Quran, Allah claims Jesus never died. That's one thing. And he claims to have never asserted deity. We'll also talk about how modern Muslims won't necessarily have a view that coheres. It's not necessarily the same as the primary source documents of their own religion. So the Quran and the Hadith. We talked about some of the modern Muslim beliefs about how great Muhammad was. We talked about how the Quran is the ultimate authority and how the Hadith and Fatwas are the lower levels and they're subordinate to the Quran when we talked about Sharia. Something else to take into consideration is epistemologies. Now, oftentimes when you're talking about the Muslim world, it's going to have a huge overlap with the Eastern world, okay, and Eastern culture and Eastern epistemology. Eastern and Western minds have a different cultural guide for epistemology, generally speaking. What do I mean by that? What is epistemology? Epistemology is the philosophy that we use to figure out if a belief is true or false. So when a Westerner is trying to figure out if something's true or false, they're going to use a different program in their brain than a Muslim will, or an Easterner will, I mean. In the West, we often have an epistemology that's locked up in reason, okay? We got this from Socrates. He very, very much influenced the way we think to where our method of finding truth is to question everything. We question and we question. Scientific method. Something has to be logical to us. We need data. We need evidence before we will believe something, generally speaking. Okay, that's not always the case, obviously. This is one of the more positive effects of the Enlightenment, was they continued with this idea and built on it. And, I whine about logical positivism. I actually like logical positivism if you don't say that something that violates it is false. If you just say, yeah, it's more likely to be true if it's been measured and repeated and it's true over and over again. I'm fine with that. It's just when you say only measurable and repeatable things are true, that's when you have problems. You can't even measure and repeat your memories. You can't even measure and repeat the sensations you feel whenever you are measuring something, the stuff going on in your own head. So it's just, if you take logical positivism and make it say more than it should, that's when I have a problem. If you nuance it and just use it to get better and better data, that's fine. Anyway, enough about the West. In the East, there's a tendency to believe that something is trustworthy if an authority says it is. You see this in the West too, like in fundamentalist Christian circles, where an authority figure, does this cohere with an authority figure? If so, then yes, it's true. Okay? But it's a very Eastern mindset. If it is something said by a trusted authority, you need to believe it and follow it. That is how you know if something is true or false. Truth is not sought with individual investigation of evidence. Okay, in Eastern thought. These are both broad strokes talking about Eastern and Western thinking, there's obviously all sorts of nuance and degrees to this. Like I said earlier, Christian fundamentalism is a lot like Islam in this way, or the Eastern way of thinking, where certain authority figures are taken to be trustworthy and the community relies on them. The parallels don't end there. So I can actually sympathize with Muslims because I think there's a lot of overlap between Islam and fundamentalism. Okay, I'll continue. The parallels don't end there. Below, I quote Nabil. I'm about to quote Nabil at length, discussing these epistemologies and how they play out in Muslim culture. And I want you to keep in mind and see the parallels to fundamentalist Christianity. But just listen to what Nabil has to say. The difference between Eastern and Western education can be traced to the disparity that divides Muslim immigrants from their children. Islamic cultures tend to establish people of high status as authorities, whereas the authority in Western culture is reason itself. These alternate seats of authority permeate the mind, determining the moral outlook of whole societies. When authority is derived from position rather than reason, the act of questioning leadership is dangerous. Okay, he's talking about when you question leadership in this sort of way, it feels dangerous because it has the potential to upset the system. Dissension is reprimanded and obedience is rewarded. Okay, anyone who's been raised fundamentalist, does that sound familiar? Correct and incorrect courses of action are assessed socially, not individually. A person's virtue is thus determined by how well he meets social expectations, not an individual determination of right and wrong. Thus, positional authority yields a society that determines right and wrong based on honor and shame. And I think it's stronger than, fundamentalist Christianity. Even fundamentalist Christianity tries to take modernist thinking and apply it to its own arguments sometimes. So it's, it's not the same thing, but there is some overlap. On the other hand, when authority is derived from reason, questions are welcome, this is Nabil continuing, because critical examination sharpens the very basis of authority. Each person is expected to critically examine their own course of action. Okay, that's the end of the quote. Alright, so let's talk about truth for a moment. How do we know if something is true or not? Can we just listen to authority figures, or are we better off researching for ourselves? If you just listen to authorities, you have no way to self-correct if you ever happen to have an authority figure who's wrong, okay? Ultimately, you're going to have to make a choice. You can be like Socrates and follow the evidence wherever it leads as you question and question. The unexamined life is not worth living, says Socrates. So you can listen to your authorities and not examine your life. Or you can either do like Socrates does and question, or you can obey and believe what you're told. I've abandoned beliefs before, okay? I know how uncomfortable it is. I have believed things my parents did not, and it was very, very hard. When you have a wonderful relationship with your parents, turning away from their beliefs is really painful. You have to risk your relationship with them. Turning away from fundamentalism and deciding the Bible wasn't true was horrible, okay? It felt immoral when I first did it. At the time, I was married to a Christian youth leader. I didn't want to share my beliefs with her. I didn't want to ruin her life. I knew I wouldn't be able to serve in the church where all these kids I loved went, and they loved me and I loved them. We had great friendships. But I had to quit volunteering because I couldn't do it because I didn't believe. I would strain friendships with my Christian friends. That's what I thought would happen when I became an atheist. So, if you're like, yeah, I'm certain of Islam, I know it's true. You need to ask yourself, do I just want it to be true? Would I follow it even if it was shown that it was false? Would I be willing to follow truth wherever it went? You need to be honest with yourself when you're asking yourself these questions. Or do I want to live for comfort? Those are your choices here, comfort or truth. You have to decide. So if we want truth, we can't hold on to an idea because we want it to be true anymore. Okay? So we need to acknowledge the things that we want to be true and put them to the side and just start looking at evidence. We have to get alone, hold our breath, and start reading. maybe listening to this podcast or podcasts. Maybe reading, seeking Allah, finding Jesus. If you really want to follow God and you believe He is the God of evidence and logic and truth, then there's nothing I can say that will take you away from Him as long as you are following the evidence and logic that bring you truth. Bart Ehrman is an agnostic. He's a New Testament scholar who became an atheist after studying the Bible and its original sources. He used to be a Christian, left the faith after finding errors in the Bible. He's often quoted by Muslims, and so I'm going to quote him here to establish our epistemology today. I think if the Muslims are going to quote this scholar, that means, and they enjoy it and they use him to discredit the Bible, then maybe they're taking his epistemology seriously, and so we're going to use his epistemology too. In regards to identifying if something's actually occurred in history, Ehrman remarks that a historian looks for the following things. Quote, historians prefer to have lots of written sources, not just one or two. The more, obviously, the better. If there were only one or two sources, you might suspect that the stories were made up. Although you would probably want to have some reason for thinking so, it is not good enough to doubt a source simply because you have a mean, negative, or pessimistic streak and choose to do so. But if there are lots of sources, just as there are lots of eyewitnesses to a car accident, then it is hard to claim that any of them just happened to make it all up. Okay? So that's the first thing. Number one, multiple attestation. You want multiple people making the same claim. He continues, historians prefer to have sources that are relatively near to the date of the person or event that they are describing. As time goes on, things do indeed get made up. And so it's better to have near contemporary sources. Okay, so first we need multiple attestation. Two, we need what's called proximity in time. Close proximity in time to the event or person described. Okay, continuing to quote from him now. Historians also like these numerous early sources to be extensive in scope. If all you have is a mere mention of a person's name in a source, it's not nearly as good as having long and extensive stories told. Moreover, in an ideal situation, the various sources that discuss a figure or an event should corroborate with each other. That is to say, at least in major parts, if not in all the details. Okay, that's the end of his quote. So with all of that laid out, we can be in agreement that we are looking for early sources where there's numerous accounts and ones that actually have substance to them. Okay, not just a mere mention of a name. First, we take all these criteria. Let's take these criteria and apply them to the Bible's version of events. Events that happened in Jesus' life. That is his death and resurrection. Really just focusing on his death. That's what Islam is arguing against. That's what the Quran says didn't happen. After that, we'll take these criteria and apply them to the Quran. Okay? First of all, the Bible isn't a single book. I'm talking about what the Bible is. It wasn't dictated to a single individual at a specific time. Okay, it's not one source. It's better to think of it as an ancient library. It was written over 2,000 year period with over 50 books in it. The books have all sorts of different authors and there's different genres. So someone's attacking the, quote, credibility of the Bible, it's already sort of a logical fallacy. Which books are you talking about? What time period? When was it changed? Okay, it's complicated talking about the Bible because it's a complicated piece of literature. It's not just one single book created by a single author at a single period of time. Specifically, if you're going to be debating whether Jesus died or claimed to be God or what went on in Jesus' life, you're going to be looking at a part of the Bible called the, quote, Gospels, okay? These Gospels are called that because they're referencing Isaiah 61, verse 1, and Isaiah 52, verse 7. So Isaiah was a prophet, that means a messenger from God, who spoke. In his book, it's debated who the author is. I think most scholars believe that at least the beginning of it might date back to around 800 BC, and then a lot of them think there's like Deutero, Isaiah, and this stuff added on later. None of that's really important for what I'm talking about, though. But this is what Isaiah says. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. Mevasher in Hebrew. Euangelion in Greek. The good news in this passage is referring to the end of exile. Okay? There were certain things that were supposed to happen when this exile ended. Yahweh was supposed to come to Zion the Gentiles are supposed to join in worship of Yahweh, and Yahweh is supposed to be reigning as king. There's going to be judgment of the wicked, and the new heavens and the new earth will be established. That's the good news here. It's the good news. So the gospel, good news writers, were tacking onto this idea from Isaiah. That word gospel is the Old English for Godspell, which means good news. So it's just a translation of Evangelion and Mevasher that I don't know why it wasn't translated. Some idiot decided not to translate it into English. And so now people say the gospel of this and the gospel of that as though it's like a genre. It's not the genre at all. The genre of the gospels is a genre called Greco-Roman historiography. It's the same genre that Plutarch wrote in, and Suetonius, Livy, and all these other Greco-Roman historiographers like Josephus. Okay. Bart Ehrman states, quote, Mark's usually dated by conservatives and liberal scholars of the New Testament to around 70 CE, Common Era. He also holds that Luke and Matthew are certainly relying on Mark, but that saying that they are therefore only one source is faulty reasoning. He says that mythicists are wrong to think this. In fact, I'm a quote from him again. Quote, nothing could be further from the truth. Matthew and Luke did indeed use Mark, but significant portions of both Gospels are not related in any way to Mark's account. And in these sections of their Gospels, Matthew and Luke record extensive independent traditions about Jesus' life, teachings, and death. So while in their shared material they do not provide corroboration without collaboration, in their unique material they do. These Gospels were probably written 10 or 15 years after Mark. So by the year 80 or 85, we have at least 3 independent accounts of Jesus' life. This is, by the way, this is still within the living memory of Jesus' disciples. So if there was an error, they could have corrected it. Okay, but that's not all. There are still other independent sources. The Gospels John is sometimes described as, continue to quote from Bart Ehrman, by the way, the Maverick Gospel, because it's so unlike the synoptic accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When they do share the same stories, John tells them in such a different way that he does not appear to have received his accounts from any or all of them. John is dated to 90 to 95 Common Era. So within the first century of 4 independent accounts of Jesus' life and death. Okay, that's the end of the quote. Other sources Ehrman mentions are the Gospel of Thomas, the Egerton II Papyrus, and the Gospel of Peter. But Egerton II has been dated much later since the writing of Ehrman's book because of a hooked apostrophe. You can look that up online. And Thomas has no mention of how Jesus died. It's just a collection of sayings that look like early Gnosticism. Gospel of Peter is from the 2nd century and records the death by crucifixion of Jesus. It's an early form of Docetism, and all that survives of it is a few pages. It's a few pages long. You can read it yourself online at earlychristianwritings.com. Okay, so Matthew and Luke both share material not found in Mark that scholars call the Gospel of Q. Additionally, so you have Mark that Matthew and Luke both quoted from, but then you also have places where it's the same, but they're not quoting from Mark, and scholars call this Q. Ehrman explains, the German scholars who developed this theory called this source the saying's Quell, that is, the saying's source. Q appears to have been predominantly made of the sayings of Jesus. I'm still quoting from Ehrman. But like the latter Gospel of Thomas and the judgment of most scholars, Q did not include an account of Jesus' death and resurrection. So let me pause right there. So the Gospel of Thomas that's not included in the canon is written later than the Gospels, but we know that this Q was written earlier than the Gospels because it's quoted by the Gospels. So it has to have existed if they're quoting it. Q did not include an account of Jesus' death and resurrection since Matthew and Luke do not share any stories of the Passion not also found in Mark. In my opinion, it's very hard to know whether or not Q lacked a Passion narrative. It would have been possible, for example, for Matthew to copy some of the stories from the Passion from Q, and for Luke not to include those stories found only in Matthew, including some of the passages in the Passion narrative were in fact Q's stories that Luke simply decided not to reproduce for reasons of his own. So from that, we're talking about Ehrman's just saying the differences between the Passion narratives in Matthew and Luke could be where one of them was quoting Q where the other one did not. Okay. That includes stories from Omar, including some of the passages in the Passion narrative were in fact Q stories that Luke simply decided not to reproduce for reasons of his own. Whether or not Q included an account of Jesus' death and resurrection, it appears the source must date to a period no later than Mark. A good number of scholars date it to the 50s. Ehrman continues, when dealing with only Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, then, we're talking about 3 books written in the end of the first century. And we're talking about at least 4 sources, because you have Mark, you have stuff independent to Matthew called M, stuff independent to Luke called L. You also have Q. The latter of 2 could easily have represented several or even many. So yeah, he's saying that M and L could have been many sources. And what he's referencing here is the beginning of Luke's gospel. And I'm going to quote it right now. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know with certainty the things you've been taught. Okay, so Luke there is saying he's drawing on many sources. Luke used other sources as well, as he intimates. This is Bart Ehrman again. He doesn't tell us how many. A lot of stories are found only in Luke. However, such as Jesus' parables, the prodigal son and the good Samaritan. Luke must have gotten these from somewhere else. Scholars have long offered good reasons for thinking Luke didn't just make everything else up. And so they call this other, now lost source, L, for Luke's special source. L may have been one document. It may have been a large number of documents. It may have included both written documents and oral traditions about Jesus. But Luke says he took from multiple sources, so there's not really a reason to doubt him there. So already we have on the one hand the Quran saying Jesus did not die on a cross, and he never claimed to be God. And we get this material from the Quran. If we take Islamic tradition at its word, and ignore hadith about Quran destruction, and ignore that the Quran wasn't written until after Muhammad had already died, then we can safely say that we get our information about Jesus from one single source, Muhammad. Okay? And that information, and that source comes to us at the earliest in 610 CE. Okay, that's over half a millennia after Jesus lived and died. So 600, it's like I can't do the math, but it's around 600 years later. 580 years later. Compare that now to Mark, L material, M material, possibly Q, John, all the early church fathers who've talked about Jesus dying on a cross. Josephus states that he was killed. Tacitus states that he was killed on a cross. Suetonius mentions an instigation of Chrestus, but he doesn't say he was killed. But he just says he was instigated. It's like pretty much the whole quote. The Jews were kicked out of Rome at the instigation of Chrestus, or something like that. If you're being objective as a historian, what scenario, honestly, are we going to say is more historical? We have one source from 600 years later saying he didn't die. We have tons of them from within 100 years saying he did die on a cross. Now let's talk about what makes something more likely to be true, too. Dying on a cross was embarrassing. Okay, we even have some written information from the first century of I think someone was angry at a prostitute. They told her to go crucify herself. It was basically how you said F you. And it wasn't just like a way of execution. It was a banner of shame. Crucifixion happened to bad people. The closest modern analogy I can think of is like a pedophile. Okay, that's what it was like for a crucified person. We have this weird positive taint on how we view crucifixion because of Christianity's influence on our society. But we need to realize in the first century it was a thing of shame. It happened to dirty, nasty people. They ripped your clothes off and hung you up in front of everyone. You were mocked. Why in the world would you make this up about the founder of your religion, who's supposed to be this Messiah who judges the nations? Okay, think about how bizarre this is. They were expecting the good news to be God coming and reigning, judging the nations, and freeing Israel from the oppressive rule of the Gentiles, the Goyim. And here's this guy who's supposed to be this Messiah, that means anointed one, this king who leads them to safety and ends the exile. And he's crucified? And they're going to just make that up? And they're going to make it up within 100 years of his life? But the guy who's, 600 years later is the one who's telling the truth? Objectively, does that make any sense at all? I think here a Muslim might argue that it was made to appear as though he'd been crucified, because that's what the Quran says, and he got the new revelation from Allah. This is not a testable theory. So you need to realize if you're believing this, it's not because of logic, and it's not because of evidence. It's not because it makes sense. It's because you were brought up to think this. You feel morally obligated to believe this, and feel like you're being immoral if you believe something different. And it's invulnerable to attack. Think about that a little bit. No matter how much evidence I showed you, I could even show you a video of Jesus being crucified, and you'd be like, oh yeah, it was just made to look that way. Doesn't that make you a little suspicious? But it can also be attacked, the Quran, in another way. It's actually a nonsensical position to say Jesus didn't die on the cross, using the Quran as your way to argue that. And I can use the Quran to prove that this is nonsensical. I can use the Quran to argue that the Bible is more reliable than the Quran. What? How does that make any sense? Well, I will tell you how that's possible next time.